yeah, no. Yo, fuck off. Get out of here.
They told us they came here because this city allows it, that because the officials, the elected officials of this city allow this kind of behavior and think that it's okay.
And frankly, the Republican supermajority has made it easy for these people to come here and exist here and feel welcome here.
And if some losers want to come in from out of town and try to do something, they can do that, but we will fight back harder and louder and stronger. And so I just want to say that to the members of the public. We are working hard to fight back and push back. And people have
I want to say to all these visitors from out of town, you're not welcome here. The people in Nashville are very welcoming. It is a city where a Muslim council person is friends with a Jewish council person and an LGBTQ council person. It is a city that welcomes immigrants, and it is a city that preaches love for all of us. So you have the right to march, but there's no room for it here.
This week, a group of neo-Nazis has been showing up around Nashville, carrying signs and getting into arguments with anyone who will engage them. As you just heard, that included a stop at the Metro Council meeting Tuesday night. A group of locals showed up to oppose them, and Zulfat Swara, an at-large council member, eventually had them cleared from the room. To help us make sense of all this, and to better understand why hate groups like these have been visiting Nashville more and more, we turn to an expert, who is also a fellow Nashvilleian. Dr. Sophie Bjork-James is assistant professor of anthropology at Vanderbilt University. She specializes in racism and white nationalist movements. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. It's Banner and Company. Dr. Bjork-James, I know you're in the middle of a research trip, and I want to thank you for taking the time to join us remotely. Can you give me just a thumbnail sketch of your background and how in the world you got into this work?
Sure. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, but I'm originally from Spokane, Washington, and I grew up in an era when the largest white supremacist compound in the country was in like halfway between where my dad lived and where my mom lived. So I grew up with this awareness of a white supremacist compound that would organize KKK rallies in local cities and really invoke terror in the surrounding communities. And when I started graduate school, I decided to study online white nationalism. So I've now spent around 20 years monitoring the online white nationalist movement. I've also studied the white evangelical political movement through ethnographic research in Colorado. And I'm in the middle of doing research for a new book project on how communities can organize against white supremacy and against anti-democratic movements. So I'm really happy to be here talking about my research at this really important time.
When you were growing up there in the Pacific Northwest, how did the community react there?
Yeah, I think there was unfortunately a lot of apathy, that a lot of disdain for these, unpopular far-right actors. But there was a lot of kind of silent disdain, and and there was some organizing. So they're starting soon after the Aryan Nations compound was formed, a group of civil rights activists got together to try fight it. And what they really did is built a decades-long movement in the region that is focused on not just countering the racist groups in the area, but also working to create a space that was more welcoming for all different groups of people. And so they organized, they organized for hate crimes regulation. They organized counter demonstrations and organized to create support for victims of hate crimes. All things that are really important in a context like is happening in Nashville that is seen, I think, and we're going to probably see more of it, increasing efforts by far-right racist and anti-Jewish groups coming out in public to try to gain more power and more recognition.
Oddly, or even coincidentally, I went to high school in Skokie, Illinois, and had just finished high school when the infamous Nazi march was planned there. And of course, that led to a court decision on free speech. And that's always an underlying theme in all of this, isn't it?
For sure. I mean, the United States is founded on, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And that's a really tricky issue when it comes to countering hate groups. But I also think there's many different ways that communities can work to try to keep people safe, especially people who are the targets of these hate groups, safe without actually curtailing freedom of speech.
Help us to understand who these people are. Is there a profile? Are they raised with these beliefs? Does something happen to them to adopt these beliefs?
Yeah, so I'm a cultural anthropologist. So my research is really looking at broader cultural trends. And I think what we see in the United States is that ever since the abolition of slavery, there have been movements organizing to defend white supremacy. And, sometimes they're very marginal. Sometimes they have been at the center of political power in the United States. But really if we look at the U.S. history, we definitely see this relationship between, as with each step to expand multiracial democracy, to challenge white supremacy and actually create an equal society, has been met by organized racism, by organized white supremacist groups, right? So we can see, right, just south of us in Nashville, in Pulaski, Tennessee, at the close of the Civil War, the KKK is formed as a vigilante terrorist organization to both enact harm against individual African Americans, but also to reinstate white power within the government. And we can see that at each effort to expand multiracial democracy has been met with these kind of movements. So it's not new, unfortunately, right? It's part of this very long tradition. And I think what's happening now with social media is that it's really spreading like wildfire, white supremacist ideas, and responding to demographic changes, right? That within the next 20 years, the United States is projected to become a majority people of color country. If we look generationally, younger people are already majority people of color. And that is really reshaping the conversations about what is America? What are American values, right? And they're not just white Christian, right? They're multiracial, multi-religious. And that's really provoking a lot of fear, and especially people, this is from national surveys are showing, it's provoking a lot of fear in people who identify as more conservative and identify as white. And so I think we're seeing this backlash happening now, and especially with social media, there can be this spread of really hateful conspiracy theories that can mobilize people to want to join these kind of groups.
I'm Demetria Kalodimos. It's Banner and Company. We'll be right back. If you're interested in building a more thriving and inclusive community by turning thoughtful generosity into positive change, well, you might want to know about one of our sponsors here at Banner and Company, the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. It matches compassionate givers with worthy causes in ways that benefit all of us. Check them out at cfmt.org. People can consume social media sort of in private, but the whole motivation is to be very public with things that they post. It's sort of a strange dichotomy there.
Yeah, I would say it's really disturbing when you have people with giant Nazi flags walking down town, right down the streets, harassing people. But the Southern Poverty Law Center tracks hate groups in the United States, and they found that consistently there's 800 to 900 hate groups across the country, and anti-governmental groups that. They're not all white supremacist groups, but a lot of them are. In 2023, they found over 1,300 hate groups across the country. So most of them are organizing kind of behind the scenes. I think that what we're seeing right now is this effort by some of the more radical groups to experiment with how public they can actually go, right? And I think what's happening in Nashville as Nashville's become more of a center for the right and like the conservative movement in the country. I think it's becoming a target by hate groups saying, hey, we agree on many of the issues with the conservative movement in terms of anti-LGBTQ issues, right? In terms of the opposition to discussions of diversity and racism. So can we actually build partnerships? Can we actually move the conversation further to the right and more explicitly racist and full of anti-Jewish hatred? I think that's really what we're seeing now, is they're experimenting with how tolerant will the city be to their messages.
So what are some strategies other than this silent, almost perceived tolerance?
Yeah, I think what's happening in our particular moment is that anyone who supports democracy, anyone who opposes hateful movements, hateful rhetoric, intolerance, it's really calling on all of us to be involved. And that can seem scary, but if we're silent, then we're allowing them to claim more and more public space and intolerance. And some of us are more targeted than others, right? People of color, Muslims, Jews, people in the LGBTQ community are incredibly vulnerable to these kind of movements. And so even if we aren't one of those demographics, we really need to be involved in opposing them. So there are so many different ways to be involved, but what's important is that we're not silently disdainful of those messages. That is not helpful. It is not helpful to the potential victims of these movements, and it's not helpful in terms of challenging whether or not we're going to tolerate their messages as a society. So a few different ways that people can be involved, right? I strongly advise against actually, if you're walking around and stumble upon a group of white supremacists, I strongly advise against actually trying to get in a fight with them. That is why they're there, right? The reason why they're in public is they're experimenting with expanding their hateful messages, but they're also wanting to provoke a response. Most of these groups are not only white supremacist groups, but they're male supremacist groups. They're men who want to feel manly and in charge and like warriors. And so when they get to have people come up and yell at them and they get to yell in their faces, it's really fitting into the narrative that they want, right? And so I would say, don't yell. If you run into a Nazi on the street, try to avoid just getting in a yelling confrontation with them. That doesn't mean necessarily ignoring them, right? The most important thing is always caring about your own safety and not doing anything that will put you in a potentially dangerous situation. But I think one of the things that I've learned from studying the opposition to white nationalism in the Northwest is that humor is the best strategy.
Really?
It's not to make light of the situation, but I think what doesn't work is fighting with them on their turf, which is they want to be seen as manly heroes, right? Out saving the white race. And so if there's ways to kind of poke fun at them or to kind of not engage in a confrontation where they can then like strut around and think that they've become the heroic warriors that they wanted to be, that's I think one of the best ways to engage, and to engage collectively, like but not to actually get in one-on-one shouting matches. That's just why they're there, right? And it's hard because if you feel personally targeted, if you feel like they represent a threat to all of your values, you're going to want to engage and fight with them, but you're not going to change their minds. And what you are doing is giving them the kind of fuel or fury for their fury that they want. So I think that there's different ways to kind of bring in humor while also challenging their presence, right? Another thing that's really important is to be public. So different ways that people have done that, right? There can be demonstrations where people are, unified and really celebrating love and equality and diversity that are a stand against extremist groups. And when we can show up in the thousands, when they're showing up in the dozens, right? It really shows, it's a very important response, not just to the neo-Nazis or the white supremacists, but it's also a really important response to the groups that are targeted by those movements. To say, okay, there's a few scary dudes hanging out downtown, but I also can see that thousands of my neighbors actually are against that message. So having really big rallies that aren't necessarily trying to be across the street from where the white supremacists are marching, but are really just shows of support for diversity and against racism and anti-Jewish prejudice are really important. And so that's another thing that can happen. A third example is there's been really successful campaigns of getting businesses to show signs of support for diversity and against white supremacy, and having campaigns where people can see visibly, right? People can have signs in their yards, but businesses especially can have post signs in their windows, like declaring that they are opposing hate. And I think all of these can help kind of make it show both to the victims or targets of these movements, but also to the movements themselves that the community is against them, right? And that they shouldn't continue to target the community.
Yeah, but we've seen even lately some rather large businesses headquartered here. I'm thinking Tractor Supply and others coming out publicly saying, we're putting to a stop to DEI. We don't want to celebrate these things. I mean, I'm not so sure it's easy for the business community to jump on board.
Right. And I think that is a question. I mean, that's also one of the reasons why Nashville is getting targeted, right? Is that white nationalists are trying to say, hey, you don't support DEI, right? You're against critical race theory. You're against LGBTQ rights. So, hey, we agree on so many things. Like, let me also bring in, my anti-Jewish conspiracies, my more explicit white supremacist views, and to try to make them more normal, right? And so I think it becomes a question of, okay, well, it's actually very important to ask people, ask for businesses, ask for politicians, ask for community leaders to be like, can you stand against neo-Nazis, right? And I think that that's an important thing to be asking in our community right now, and it's really important for people, right, who may identify as politically liberal to do that, but it's also important for people who identify as conservative to do that, right? To be like that, because they are in Nashville because they want to convert more conservatives to an explicitly white supremacist agenda. That is why they're there. That is why they chose Nashville. That's why they're going to keep coming back to Nashville, because they think that they can convert more people in the conservative movement to an explicitly white supremacist position. And I think it's really important for the community at large to be asked, right? And again, right, everyday people, business owners, community leaders and politicians to be like, well, can we draw a line collectively and say, explicit hate, explicit white supremacist movements are not welcome here. And I think showing that solidarity is really important, but also asking that question is important.
I'm Demetria Kalodimos. My guest today is Dr. Sophie Bjork-James. We'll be right back. This relatively new group, or at least new to me, for one thing, they've co-opted a Yiddish word as part of their name, which seems utterly strange. But what do you know about them? Are they new? Are they on the rise?
I want to get away from naming some of these groups, because I think in some ways spreading their name is doing exactly what they want.
Giving it more oxygen.
Right.
Yeah.
There could be 20 members, and if they show up in a downtown, suddenly everyone's talking about them, and that is exactly what they want. Because they want more people, especially younger white men, to stumble upon their website, to stumble upon their social media accounts, and to become indoctrinated into their racist conspiracy theories. Right? And so I think it's really tricky in that we don't want to ignore them, but I also think we really don't want to be directing more traffic to their social media feeds, which are really tailored to spread conspiracy theories. And so what I would say is that there are a number of neo-Nazi groups that hold anti-Jewish prejudice at their center and are really working to try to spread anti-Jewish hatred right now, right? And are doing this in Nashville. I mean, there's been so many accounts of, people spreading, anti-Jewish tracts, like in different neighborhoods, right? Like I live in East Nashville, and just last year there was people filling baggies with dried corn and anti-Jewish pamphlets that were just tossing them in people's yards. And I've heard of plenty accounts of this happening in different parts of the city, right? And so I think there is this concerted effort right now by explicitly neo-Nazi groups to kind of take this moment of we are in an era where diversity is suddenly a bad word for a lot of the conservative movement, and opposing DEI is part of the movement to experiment and say, well, can we also then push an explicitly neo-Nazi agenda? And so I think that's what we're seeing with this latest round of, can we actually, of this group experimenting, they're trying to see, can we get away with showing up with actual Nazi flags in downtown, right? And I think that's where we as a community, and I mean all of us, got to really ask ourselves, is that the kind of community that we want, right? And if not, then we all really need to stand up against that. There's studies that show that neo-Nazi groups, they'll go into communities, they'll put up flyers, they'll put out tracts and mailboxes and on people's yards, they'll hang flyers, they'll have some small demonstrations, and what they're really looking at is where is going to be receptive. And if there's an organized response, not just by a small response by some kind of, the kind of typical players, but an actual community-wide response, then they're less likely to want to keep coming and targeting that community. And I think that's really important.
I've heard some people theorize, and this may be a wacky theory, but with the RNC underway and Nashville famously rejecting hosting that gathering, that might explain some of the recent ramp up here, and that all eyes are on political news, particularly after the assassination attempt. I'm not equating Republican politics with white supremacy, but could there be a reason why they're choosing right now to be more visible in our city?
Absolutely. I think that I think it is important to point out that there is appears to be an explicit target on Nashville right now. But yeah, I think there is this experiment moving up towards the November election and what might happen after, of trying to expand neo-Nazi power explicitly and feeling like there might be more allies happening right now.
Is it true that these sort of movements have ebbs and flows in our history? Or do we just not hear about them and think that they've gone that their numbers are decreasing or they've gone away or they're dwindling?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think both were true. Like some, there's times when they're in the media and times when they're not. There's times when they ebb and flow for sure. I think that there's a pretty clear agreement that things radically shifted around 2015 or 2016, right? Of kind of the movement exploding because they were very successful at spreading their message on social media. And so I feel like what's happening right now and leading up, it is very much tied, I think, to the election, right? Of these groups thinking this is our time to come out from our, the dark corners of the web where we typically meet and see if we can actually take over some cities and experiment with that. So I think that we're seeing a moment of mobilization happening right now.
We've had at least a couple of these public events where the participants hide their faces, either with masks or with socks or whatever. It begs the question, why hide if you think your message is so important it needs to be spoken loudly?
I think it is. I mean, it's a strategy of people trying to keep their jobs sometimes, right? Like people who have been, uncovered as participating in neo-Nazi groups can sometimes be, lose their employment, be ostracized. And I think that that's important. I think it's important to not make it acceptable to be a neo-Nazi, right? If you're going to be showing up to one of these rallies, then you're clearly supporting that ideology, and that's going to shape your behavior in other aspects of your life. And I think there's also a long history of, white supremacists, right, covering their faces because it's intimidating as well, because you don't know who it is. It could be people in the community. It could be people from, a few states away. You don't really know who they are. And I think they cover their faces both because it's intimidating and because they want to avoid the consequences of being publicly known as being a neo-Nazi.
We have had some pretty bold people, true attention seekers this week that wanted the camera and wanted to be right up in the lens and show their faces. Is that unusual, or does that signal some sort of shift?
Yeah, I think that there's different groups have different tactics, right? And I think we've seen a few groups come through Nashville where, everyone's wearing the exact same clothes and uniform and they're all covering their faces. And I think the latest group is a little has been showing their faces. And I think, it's more provocative. And it seems like that group has been more focused on trying to engage with opponents or people who oppose their views and yelling at them. But I think it is part of the normalization efforts of trying to normalize their ideas and to be provocative.
Do you ever think, I'll just study something else? I'm overwhelmed with ruminating about hate? Or, how do you escape from this? How do you keep yourself sane?
That's why right now I'm studying, the anti-racist. I'm studying the real civil rights, human rights heroes who, work to defend democratic values and anti-racism and have made a huge impact, right, in their communities. I think it's really important that we can be a little historically deterministic, right? We love to talk about the metaphors of pendulum swings and, in political history and especially in U.S. history. And I think we can be a little deterministic of, it's the tide is changing and now the forces of supremacy are just going to win. And I think that really forecloses the possibility of response, right? And I think for me, I care about, I care about democracy. I want to be able to continue to have the democratic norms that, so many people fought and died to make sure we had, right? As, real multiracial democracy, right? And I want to be able to maintain that. And so for me, that's why I do the work that I do. White supremacists really, they have a vision of male supremacy, of white supremacy that they want to impose, but the tools to do that are really to destroy democracy, right? And so I think it really calls on all of us to if we care about democracy, if we care about, equality, if we care about justice, then we have to know what's happening from the people who oppose those values. And, I think there's a lot of history is not like preordained, and that if we want our democracy to be sustained, and if we want to maintain the civil rights victories that have been won over time, like it's our moment for all of us who care about those issues to be mobilizing together. And again, right, not everyone is going to feel comfortable marching in the streets, right? there is a role for everyone in opposing white supremacy, neo-Nazism, and supporting democracy. There's a role for everyone. And it really means we all need to be involved in some way, right? And the beauty of it, we don't have to all be involved in the same way, right? Mm-hmm. Like some of us can write letters. Some of us can, be lobbying our politicians. Some of us can be organizing and going to rallies. Some of us can be monitoring white supremacists in our communities online, right? There's many different things that we can be involved in. But the one thing I would say is that if you yourself are not a potential target of these movements, then you need to really be supporting organizations that are supporting the potential victims of them. Because every time you see people, with Nazi banners, or you see people who support white supremacy marching in the street, what we're not seeing is that there's likely a pattern of harassment, of discrimination, of potential hate crimes against the groups that they target.
As a Nashvilleian and as a scholar, are you worried about this turning violent?
Absolutely. There's every indication of potential violence. No matter what, moving up to the November election, whatever happens after the November election. But again, it comes down to, I think a lot of people are afraid of violence and then they don't end up standing up for what they care about. And I think that's a huge problem. Right. And I'm not saying everyone should go and be a counter demonstrator and put themselves in, potential line of fire or in a potential violent situation. But I do think that what I have seen doing research, especially in the Northwest, is that there's a lot of fear of potential retribution that keeps people from actually being in public with their values, right? About supporting democracy, about supporting equality and justice, and that fear can end up being a way to just cede more power from the white supremacist groups. Cede more power to them, right? It can be because if people are afraid, even if they're the majority of a community are opposed to white supremacy, but are kind of sitting at home, kind of complaining about it, but not out in public because they're afraid, then the white supremacists win, unfortunately, right? And that they're going to experiment with taking on more space, taking over more, trying to gain more power. And that can be a really dangerous thing. So, but I do think that we are in a treacherous moment in Nashville, but also in the country, like around the possibility of more political violence. And I think the more we support, the more that we can protect our democratic institutions and democratic values, the better we are, and the less likely that violence is.
Your name goes on published work. You speak out. Does that? Are you afraid of the messages that you put across coming back to hurt you? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It's for someone who does this kind of work, it's always something that I have to consider, especially as someone who, writes for the public and, talks to journalists and has my name out there. But again, like I want to learn, I've learned from the heroes of my work that I've studied that we can't let fear silence us, right? And like if fear silences us, then they win, right? The white supremacists win because, right, they're the ones making all the noise and taking up all the space, and we'll only gain more power that way.
Banner and Company is a production of the new Nashville Banner. Our producers are Steve Haruch and Andrea Tudhope. Original music by Verlin Thompson. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company. We do this thing, Sophie, on this podcast, and usually it might be lighter fare and lighter subjects, but we have our guests answer a question that's posed by a previous guest, and we do it out of this fishbowl, sans the fish. So I think I'm going to pick one for you. Ooh, okay, this comes from Betsy Phillips. What
thing did you want to know but could never find out?
That's a great question. Whew. I feel like, you know what, I'm going to say, like, thinking about the work that I do, it's why are the people who want to defend democracy and equality often the ones who are like, why is that an often quieter fight than the ones who want to support, who are fighting for white supremacy and anti-Jewish prejudice, right? Like, why is it that, like, they're very small in numbers, especially nationally, and yet they have so much power to intimidate and kind of define how a community is when they are the minority. They're a very marginal group, and yet, you know, the majority, which is actually supports equality and democracy, are much quieter about that. I feel like that is a huge question that I'm going to be probably asking for a very long time.